A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, Chapter 1, Parts 7 and 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 1, Parts 7 and 8. Part 7. The Oligarchic Revolution. At Athens in these months there was distress, fear, and discontent. How deeply the people felt the pressure of the long war is uttered in the comedy of Lysistrata, or Dame Dispander, which the poet Aristophanes brought out at this crisis. The heroine unites all the women of the belligerent cities of Greece into a league to force the men to make peace. Under the ribald humour there pierces here and there a note of pathos not to be found in the poet's earlier peace plays, the Acarnanians and the Peace. War is not a time for marrying and giving in marriage. "Never mind us married women," says Lysistrata, "it is the thought of the maidens growing old at home that goes to my heart." "Do not men grow old too?" asks the Probulos, who argues with her. "Ah, but it is not the same thing. A man, though his hair be grey, can soon pick up a young girl, but a woman's season is short, and if she miss her chance then, no one will marry her." But the fear of Persia was the shadow which brooded darkest over Athens at this time, and there was also a lurking suspicion of treachery, a dread that the oligarchical party were planning a revolution, or even intriguing with the enemy at Decelea. 2 months after the Lysistrata, at the great feast of Dionysus, Aristophanes brought out a play whose plot had nothing to do with politics, the Celebrants of the Thesmophoria. But the fears that were in the hearts of many were echoed by the poet, when his chorus called upon Athena, the sole keeper of our city, to come as the hater of tyrants. Lovers of the democracy might well pray to the guardian lady of the city. The opportunity for which the oligarchs had waited so long had come at last. For outside their own ranks there was a large section of influential men who were dissatisfied with the existing forms of government, and, though opposed to oligarchy, desired a modification of the constitution. There was a fair show of reason for arguing that the foreign policy had been mismanaged by the democracy, and that men of education and knowledge had not a sufficient influence on the conduct of affairs. The chief of those who desired to see the establishment of a moderate polity, neither an extreme democracy nor an oligarchy, but partaking of both, was Theramenes, whose father, Hagnon, was one of the Probuli. The watchword of Theramenes and his party was, "The old constitution of our fathers." By this they meant not the constitution of Solon, but the constitution before Solon. They interpreted the whole history of Athens in accordance with their political views. They condemned Solon as the author of democracy, the first of a long line of mischievous demagogues. They made out that the Areopagus, and not Themistocles, was the hero of Salamis. They branded Aristides, founder of the Delian confederacy, for organising a system which fed 20,000 idlers on the allied cities. They represented Pericles as a man of no ideas of his own, but depending upon others to prompt him. After 2 centuries of evil government, the Athenians must go back to the times before Solon, and revive in some new form the constitution of Dracon. This constitution of Dracon, of which the chief feature was a council of 400, had never existed. It was fathered upon Dracon by Theramenes and his friends. The extreme oligarchs, though the ideal of Theramenes was not theirs, were ready in the first instance to act in concert with the moderate party for the purpose of upsetting the democracy. The soul of the plot was Antiphon of Rhamnus, an eloquent orator and advocate, who had made his mark in the days of Cleon. He was unpopular on account of his undisguised oligarchical views. The historian Thucydides describes him as a man who in virtue fell short of none of his contemporaries, and by virtue is meant disinterested and able devotion to his party. Other active conspirators were Pisander, who had been in old days a partisan of Cleon, and Phrynichus, who was one of the commanders of the fleet stationed at Samos. The prospects of the movement were good. It was favoured by the Probuli and by most of the officers of the fleet. Moreover, the Athenians, as they had shown already by the appointment of the Probuli, were in a temper, with the fear of Persia before their eyes, to sacrifice their constitution if such a sacrifice would save the city. Alcibiades had entered into negotiations with the officers at Samos, promising to secure an alliance with Tissaphernes, but representing the abolition of democracy as a necessary condition. Most of the oligarchical conspirators were pleased with the scheme, and even the army was seduced by the idea of receiving pay from the great king. Some indeed of the more sagacious thought they saw through the designs of Alcibiades, and Phrynichus, who aspired himself to be the leader of the revolution, detected a rival, and tried by various intrigues to thwart him. Alcibiades was certainly no friend of oligarchy, but it was his policy in any case to upset the existing democracy, which would never recall him. If an oligarchy were established, he might intervene to restore the democracy, and in return for such a service all would be forgiven. But he would have to be guided by events. Pisander was sent to Athens to prepare the way for the return of Alcibiades and a modification of the democracy. The people were at first indignant at the proposal to change the constitution and recall the renegade. The Eumolpidae denounced the notion of having any dealings with the profaner of the mysteries. But the cogent argument that the safety of Athens depended on separating Persia from the Peloponnesians, and that this could be managed only by Alcibiades, and that the great king would not trust Athens so long as she was governed by a popular constitution, had its effect. And there was, moreover, powerful but secret influence at work through the Hetairai, or political clubs. It was voted that Pisander and other envoys should be sent to negotiate a treaty with Tissaphernes, and to arrange matters with Alcibiades. It appeared at once that Alcibiades had promised more than he could perform. There had indeed been a serious rupture between Tissaphernes and Sparta. Lichas, a Spartan commissioner, who conferred with the satrap, denounced the terms of the treaties. He pointed out the monstrous consequences of the clause which assigned to the king power over all the countries which his ancestors had held, for this would involve Persian dominion over Thessaly and other lands of northern Greece. On such terms, he said, we will not have our fleet paid, and he asked for a new treaty. Tissaphernes departed in anger. But when it came to a question of union with Athens, Tissaphernes showed that he did not wish to break with the Peloponnesians. He proposed impossible conditions to the Athenian envoys, and then made a new treaty with the Spartans, modifying the clause to which Lichas objected. The territory which the Spartans recognised as Persian was now expressly confined to Asia. But though the reasons for a revolution, so far as they concerned Tissaphernes and Alcibiades, seemed thus to be removed, the preparations had advanced so far that the result of the mission of Pisander produced no effect on the course of events. The conspirators did not scruple to use menaces and even violence. Androcles, a strong democrat, who had been prominent in procuring the condemnation of Alcibiades, was murdered. Some others of less note were made away with in like manner, and there was a general feeling of fear and mistrust in the city. But there was a widespread conviction that the existence of Athens was at stake, and that some change in the constitution was inevitable. The news that Abydus and Lampsacus had revolted may have hastened the final act. The revolution was peaceably effected through the co-operation of the 10 Probuli. A decree was passed that the Probuli and 20 others chosen by the people should form a commission of 30, who should jointly devise proposals for the safety of the state, and lay them before the assembly on a fixed day. When the day came, the assembly met at the temple of Poseidon at Colonus, about a mile from the town. After preliminary measures to secure impunity for a proposal involving a subversion of existing laws, a radical change was brought forward and carried. The sovereign assembly was to consist in future not of the whole people, but of a body of about 5,000, those who were strongest physically and financially. 100 men were to be chosen, 10 by each tribe, for the purpose of electing and enrolling the 5,000. Pay for almost all public offices was to be abolished. To these revolutionary measures a saving clause was attached. They were to remain in force as long as the war lasts, and thus the people was more easily induced to pass them. But this was only preliminary. A constitution had still to be framed. When the 5,000 were elected, they chose a commission of 100 men to draw up a constitution. The scheme which they framed is highly remarkable, as a criticism on certain defects in the constitution which was now to be overthrown. The body of 5,000 were not to act as an assembly. There was, in fact, to be no assembly. The 5,000 were to be divided into 4 parts, and each part was to act as council for a year in turn. The council would elect the higher magistrates from its own number. Thus the difficulties of administration which arose in the double system, where the council's action was hampered by the assembly, would be done away with, and the inclusion of the generals and magistrates in the council was a necessary consequence. Under the democracy, the holders of office could influence the assembly against the council. Under the new scheme there would be no room for such collisions. One fatal defect in this scheme was the size of the administrative body, and if it had been tried we may be sure that it would not have worked. But it was never tried. It passed the assembly as a scheme to come into force in the future. But in the meantime a further proposal of the 100 commissioners enacted that the state should be administered by a council of 400, in which each of the 10 tribes was to be represented by 40 members. It would seem, but it is not quite certain, that the election of the council was managed in the following way. The assembly, which created it, chose 5 men under the title of presidents, who were empowered to nominate 100 councillors, and each of these councillors co-opted 3 others. But both the presidents in their nomination, and the 100 councillors in their co-option, were limited to a number of candidates who were previously chosen by the tribes. The 400 were instituted as merely a provisional government, but the entire administration was placed in their hands, the management of the finances and the appointment of the magistrates. The 5,000 were to meet only when summoned by the 400, so that the assembly ceased to have any significance, and the provisional constitution was an unadulterated oligarchy. The Council of 400 was proclaimed to be a revival of the imaginary constitution of Dracon, under which Athens flourished before demagogues led her into evil paths. But the whole fabric of Cleisthenes, the 10 tribes, and the demes, was retained. The existing council of 500 went out of office before the end of the civil year, and 7 days later the administration of the 400 began. Throughout these transactions intimidation was freely used by the conspirators, and we are told that they went with hidden daggers into the council chamber, and forced the 500 to retire. Thucydides admires the ability of the men who carried out this revolution. An easy thing it certainly was not, 100 years after the fall of the tyrants, to destroy the liberties of the Athenian people, who were not only a free, but during more than 1/2 of this time had been an imperial people. It may be asked why a provisional government was introduced, instead of proceeding at once to the establishment of the permanent constitution which the 100 commissioners had framed. Here we touch upon the inwardness of the political situation. The 2 constitutions betray the double influence at work in the revolution. The establishment of the 400 was a concession made to Antiphon and the Oligarchs by Theramenes and the moderates, who regarded it as only preliminary, while the Oligarchs hoped to render it permanent. Part 8. Fall of the 400. The polity. The democracy restored. For more than 3 months the 400 governed the city with a high hand, and then they were overthrown. Their success had been largely due to the absence of so many of the most democratic citizens in the fleet at Samos, and it was through the attitude of the fleet that their fall was brought about. The sailors rose against the oligarchic officers and the oligarchs of Samos, who were conspiring against the popular party and had murdered the exile Hyperbolus. The chief leaders of this reaction were Thrasybulus and Thrasyllus, who persuaded the soldiers and sailors to proclaim formally their adhesion to the democracy and their hostility to the 400. The assembly, which had been abolished at Athens, was called into being at Samos, and the army, representing the Athenian people, deposed the generals and elected others. The Athenians at Samos felt that they were in as good a position as the Athenians at Athens, and they hoped still to obtain the alliance of Persia, through the good offices of Alcibiades, whose recall and pardon were formally voted. Thrasybulus fetched Alcibiades to Samos, and he was elected a general. The hoped-for alliance with Persia was not effected, but it was at least something that Tissaphernes did not use the large Phoenician fleet which he had at Aspendus against the Athenians, and that his relations with the Peloponnesians were becoming daily worse. He went to Aspendus, but he never brought the ships, and it was a matter of speculation what the object of his journey was. Thucydides records his own belief that Tissaphernes wanted to wear out and to neutralise the Hellenic forces. His object was to damage them both, while he was losing time in going to Aspendus, and to paralyse their action, and not strengthen either of them by his alliance. For if he had chosen to finish the war, finished it might have been once for all, as any one may see. The Athenians at Samos now proposed to sail straight to Athens and destroy the 400. The proposal shows how much the fleet despised the Peloponnesian navy, which, under its incompetent admiral Astyochus, had been spending the summer in doing nothing. But to leave Samos would have been madness, and Alcibiades saved them from the blunder of sacrificing Iona and the Hellespont. Negotiations were begun with the oligarchs at Athens, and Alcibiades expressed himself satisfied with the assembly of 5,000, but insisted that the 400 should be abolished. As a matter of fact, the overtures from Samos were welcome to the majority of the 400, who were dissatisfied with their colleagues and their own position. The nature of an oligarchy which supplants a democracy was beginning to show itself. The instant an oligarchy is established, says Thucydides, the promoters of it disdain mere equality, and everybody thinks that he ought to be far above everybody else. Whereas in a democracy, when an election is made, a man is less disappointed at a failure because he has not been competing with his equals. Moreover, the 400 were at first professedly established as merely a temporary government, preliminary to the establishment of a polity which would be less an oligarchy than a qualified democracy. Such a polity was the ideal of Theramenes, and he was impatient to constitute it. Thus there was a cleavage in the 400, the extreme oligarchs on one side, led by Antiphon and Phrynichus, the moderate reformers on the other, led by Theramenes. While the moderates had the support of the army at Samos behind them, the extreme party looked to the enemy for support, and sent envoys to Sparta for the purpose of concluding a peace. In the meantime they fortified Aetionia, the mole which formed the northern side of the entrance to the great harbour of Piraeus. The object was to command the entrance so as to be able either to admit the Lacedaemonians or to exclude the fleet of Samos. When the envoys returned from Sparta, without having made terms, and when a Peloponnesian squadron was seen in the Saronic Gulf, the movement against the oligarchs took shape. Phrynichus was slain by foreign assassins in the market-place. The soldiers who were employed in building the fort at Aetionia were instigated by Theramenes to declare against the oligarchy, and after a great tumult at the Piraeus, the walls of the fort were pulled down, to the cry of "Whoever wishes the 5,000 and not the 400 to rule, let him come and help." Nobody in the crowd really knew whether the 5,000 existed as an actually constituted body or not. When the fort was demolished, an assembly was held in the theatre on the slope of Munichia, the agitation subsided, and the peaceable negotiations with the 400 ensued. A day was fixed for an assembly in the theatre of Dionysus, to discuss a settlement on the basis of the constitution of the 5000. But on the very day, just as the assembly was about to meet, the appearance of a Lacedaemonian squadron, which had been hovering about off the coast of Salamis, produced a temporary panic and a general rush to the Piraeus. It was only a fright, so far as the Piraeus was concerned, but there were other serious dangers ahead, as every one saw. The safety of Euboea was threatened, and the Athenians depended entirely on Euboea, now that they had lost Attica. The Lacedaemonian fleet, 42 ships under Agesandridas, doubled Sunium, and sailed into Oropus. The Athenians sent 36 ships under Thimochares to Eretria, where they were forced to fight at once, and were utterly defeated. All Euboea then revolted, except Oreus in the north, which was a settlement of Athenian clerics. At no moment, perhaps, since the Persian War, was the situation at Athens so alarming. She had no reserve of ships, the army at Samos was hostile, Euboea, from which she derived her supplies, was lost, and there was feud and sedition in the city. It was a moment which might have inspired the Lacedaemonians to operate with a little vigour both by land and sea. Athens could not have resisted a combined attack of Agis from Decelea and Agesandridas at the Piraeus. But the Lacedaemonians were, as Thucydides observes, very convenient enemies, and they let the opportunity slip. The battle of Eretria struck, however, the hour of doom for the oligarchs. An assembly in the Pnyx deposed the 400, and voted that the government should be placed in the hands of a body consisting of all those who could furnish themselves with arms, which body should be called the 5000. Legislators, or nomothetai, were appointed to draw up the details of the constitution, and all pay for offices was abolished. Most of the oligarchs escaped to Decelea, and one of them betrayed the fort of Oenoe on the frontier of Boeotia to the enemy. 2, Antiphon and Archeptolemus, were executed. The chief promoter of the new constitution was Theramenes. It was a constitution such as he had conceived from the beginning, though apparently not actually the same as that which had been proposed by the 100 commissioners. Thucydides praises it as a constitution in which the rule of the many and the rule of the few were fairly tempered. It was the realisation of the ultimate intentions of most of those who had promoted the original resolution. It is certain that Theramenes, from the very beginning, desired to organise a polity, with democracy and oligarchy duly mixed. His acquiescence in a temporary oligarchy was a mere matter of necessity, and the nickname of Cothurnus, the loose buskin that fits either foot, given to him by the oligarchs, was not deserved. In the meantime the supine Spartan admiral Astyochus had been superseded by Mindarus, and the Peloponnesian fleet, invited by Pharnabazus, sailed for the Hellespont. The Athenian fleet under Thrasybulus and Thrasyllus followed, and forced them to fight in the straits. The Athenians, with 76 ships, were extended along the shore of the Chersonese, and the object of the Peloponnesians, who had 10 more ships, was to outflank and so prevent the enemy from sailing out of the straits, and at the same time to press their centre in upon the land. The Athenians, to thwart this intention, extended their own right wing, and in doing so weakened the whole line. The Peloponnesians were victorious on the centre, but Thrasybulus, who was on the right wing, took advantage of their disorder in the moment of victory, and threw them into panic. The engagement on the Athenian left was round the cape of Cynossema, out of sight of the rest of the battle, and resulted after hard fighting in the repulse of the Peloponnesians. This victory heartened the Athenians. It was followed immediately by the recovery of Cyzicus, which had revolted. Mindarus had to send for the squadron which lay in the waters of Euboea, but only a remnant reached him. The rest of the ships were lost in a storm off Mount Athos. Another Athenian success at Abydus closed the military operations of the year, but, owing to lack of funds, the fleet had to disperse for the winter. Tissaphernes was ill satisfied with the success of Athens, and when Alcibiades paid him a visit at Sardis during the winter, he arrested him. But Alcibiades made his escape. The Peloponnesians were now vigorously supported by Pharnabazus, who was a far more valuable and trustworthy ally than Tissaphernes. In the spring Mindarus laid siege to Cyzicus, and the satrap supported him with an army. The Athenian fleet of 86 ships succeeded in passing the Hellespont unseen, and in 3 divisions, under Alcibiades, Theramenes, and Thrasybulus, took Mindarus by surprise. After a hard fought battle both by land and sea, the Athenians were entirely victorious. Mindarus was slain, and about 60 triremes were taken or sunk. This annihilated the Peloponnesian navy. A laconic dispatch announcing the defeat to the Spartan ephors was intercepted by the Athenians. "Our success is over. Mindarus is slain. The men are starving. We know not what to do." Sparta immediately made proposals of peace to Athens on the basis of the status quo. It would have been wise of Athens to accept the offer and obtain relief from the pressure of the garrison at Decelea. But there is no doubt that the feeling in the navy was entirely against a peace which did not include the restoration of the power of Athens in the Aegean and Asia Minor, and the victory of Cyzicus seemed to assure the promise of its speedy recovery, notwithstanding the purse of Pharnabazus. The Spartan overtures were rejected. The victory of Cyzicus led to a restoration of the unity of the Athenian state, which for a year had been divided into 2 parts centred in Athens and Samos. The democratic party at Athens, encouraged by the success of the thoroughly democratic navy, were able to upset the polity of Theramenes, and to restore the democracy with the unlimited franchise and the Cleisthenic Council of 500. The most prominent of the leaders of this movement was Cleophon, the lyre maker, a man of the same class as Hyperbolus and Cleon, and endowed with the same order of talent. Like Cleon, he was a strong imperialist, and he was now the mouthpiece of the prevailing sentiment for war. His financial ability seems to have been no less remarkable than that of Cleon. The remuneration of offices, which was an essential part of the Athenian democracy, was revived as a matter of course, but Cleophon instituted a new payment for which his name was best remembered by posterity. This was the 2 obol payment. Though we know that it was introduced by Cleophon, it is not recorded for what purpose it was paid or who received it. Some have supposed that it was simply the wage of the judges, that the old fee of 3 obols was revived in the reduced form of 2 obols. But this can hardly be the case. The 2 obol payment is mentioned in a manner which implies that it was something completely novel. The probability is that it was a disbursement intended to relieve the terrible pressure of the protracted war upon the poor citizens whose means of livelihood was reduced or cut off by the presence of the enemy in Attica, and we may guess that the pension of 2 obols a day was paid to all who were not in the receipt of other public money for their services in the field, on shipboard, or in the law courts. To give employment to the indigent by public works was another part of the policy of Cleophon, who herein followed the example of Pericles. In the first years of this statesman's influence the building of a new temple of Athena on the Acropolis, probably begun after the peace of Nicias, but abandoned during the Sicilian expedition, was continued. It was close to the north cliff, on the site of the royal palace of Mycenaean days, and seems to have been designed to replace the oldest temple of Athena, which held the ancient wooden statue of the goddess. This new temple Athena shared with Erechtheus, and though less magnificent than the Parthenon, it was the true centre of the city's worship of her patron goddess. Detailed accounts of the money paid to the craftsmen and labourers, citizens, metics, and slaves, who worked on the building and its sculptures, have survived, and it is interesting to find that the sculptors of the panels of the frieze were paid at standard piece rates. That this graceful Ionic temple with the Porch of the Maidens should be completed in years of sore need is a striking tribute to Athenian resilience, and in this new confidence the old system of tribute was restored. The years following the rejection of the Spartan overtures were marked by operations in the Propontis and its neighbourhood. The Athenians, under the able and strenuous leadership of Alcibiades, slowly gained ground. Thasos and Selymbria were won back. At Chrysopolis a toll station was established, at which ships coming from the Euxine had to pay 1/10 of the value of their freight. Then Chalcedon was besieged and made tributary, and finally Byzantium was starved into capitulation, so that Athens once more completely commanded the Bosphorus. Meanwhile Pharnabazus had made an arrangement to conduct Athenian envoys to Susa for the purpose of coming to terms with the great king. Nearer home Athens lost Nicaea to the Megarians, and Pylos was at length recovered by Sparta. As the distinctive feature of the last 8 years of the Peloponnesian War was the combination between Persia and Sparta, we may divide this period into 3 parts, according to the nature of the Persian co-operation. During the first 2 years it is the satrap Tissaphernes who supports the Peloponnesian operations, and Athens loses nearly all Ionia. Then the satrap Pharnabazus takes the place of Tissaphernes as the active ally of the Peloponnesians. The military operations are chiefly in the Hellespont, and Athens gradually recovers many of her losses. But the affairs of the West had begun to engage the attention of the great king Darius, who, aware that the jealousy of the 2 satraps hinders an effective policy, sends down his younger son Cyrus to take the place of Tissaphernes at Sardis, with jurisdiction over Cappadocia, Phrygia, and Lydia. The government of Tissaphernes is confined to Caria. The arrival of Cyrus on the scene marks a new turning point in the progress of the war. It was a strange sight to see the common enemy of Hellas ranged along with the victors of Plataea against the victors of Salamis. It was a shock to men of Pan-Hellenic feeling, and it was fitting that at the great Pan-Hellenic gathering at Olympia a voice of protest should be raised. Men of western Hellas beyond the sea could look with a calmer view on the politics of the East, and it was a man of western Hellas, the Leontine Gorgias himself, who lifted up an eloquent voice against the wooing of Persian favour by Greek states. Rather, he said, go to war against Persia. End of Part 8. To the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, Part 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Part 9. Downfall of the Athenian Empire. Prince Cyrus was zealous, but his zeal to intervene actively and furnish pay to the Peloponnesian seamen might have been of little use, were it not for the simultaneous appointment of a new Spartan admiral, who possessed distinguished ability and inordinate ambition. This was Lysander, who was destined to bring the long war to its close. He gained the confidence of his seamen by his care for their interests, and he won much influence over Cyrus by being absolutely proof against the temptation of bribes, a quality at which an Oriental greatly marvelled. In prosecuting the aims of his ambition, Lysander was perfectly unscrupulous, and he was a skilful diplomatist as well as an able general. While Cyrus and Lysander were negotiating, Alcibiades, after an exile of 8 years, had returned to his native city. He had been elected strategos, and had received an enthusiastic welcome. Time had in some measure dulled the sense of the terrible injuries which he had inflicted on his country, and his share in the recent recovery of the Hellespontine cities had partly at least atoned. But it was rather hope for future benefits than forgiveness for past wrongs that moved the Athenians to let bygones be bygones. They trusted in his capacity as a general, and they thought that by his diplomatic skill they might still be able to come to terms with Persia. So a decree was passed, giving him full powers for the conduct of the war, and he was solemnly freed from the curse which rested upon him as profaner of the Eleusinian rites. He had an opportunity of making his peace with the divinities of Eleusis. Ever since the occupation of Decelea, which he had done so much to bring about, the annual procession from Athens along the sacred way to the Eleusinian shrine had been suspended, and the mystic Iacchus had been conveyed by sea. Under the auspices of Alcibiades, who protected the procession by an escort of troops, the solemnity was once more celebrated in the usual way. It is possible that, if he had been bold enough to seize the opportunity of this tide of popularity, he might have established a tyranny at Athens, but he probably thought that such a venture would hardly be safe until he achieved further military or diplomatic successes. The opportunity was lost, and did not recur. A slight incident completely changed the current of feeling in Athens. An Athenian fleet was at Notium, keeping guard on Ephesus, and Lysander succeeded in defeating it and capturing 15 ships. Though Alcibiades was not present at the battle, he was responsible, and lost his prestige at Athens, where the tidings of a decisive victory was confidently expected. New generals were appointed immediately, and Alcibiades withdrew to a castle on the Hellespont, which he had provided for himself as a refuge in case of need. Conon succeeded him in chief command of the navy. The Peloponnesians during the following winter organised a fleet of greater strength than they had had for many years, 140 ships. But Lysander had to make place for a new admiral, Callicratidas. The Peloponnesians at first carried all before them. The fort of Delphinion in Chios and the town of Methymna in Lesbos were taken. Conon, who had only 70 ships, was forced into a battle outside Mytilene, and lost 30 triremes in the action. The remainder were blockaded in the harbour of Mytilene. The situation was critical, and Athens did not underrate the danger. The gold and silver dedications in the temples of the Acropolis were melted to defray the costs of a new armament. Freedom was promised to slaves, citizenship to resident aliens, for their services in the emergency, and at the end of a month Athens and her allies sent a fleet of 150 triremes to relieve Mytilene. Callicratidas, who had now 170 ships, left 50 to maintain the blockade, and sailed with the rest to meet the foe. A great battle was fought near the islets of the Arginusae, south of Lesbos, and the Athenians were victorious. 70 Spartan ships were sunk or taken, and Callicratidas was slain. An untimely north wind hindered the victors from rescuing the crews of their wrecked ships, as well as from sailing to Mytilene to destroy the rest of the hostile fleet. The success had not been won without a certain sacrifice. 25 ships had been lost with their crews. It was believed that many of the men floating about on the wreckage might have been saved if the officers had taken proper measures. The commanders were blamed. The matter was taken up by politicians at Athens. The generals were suspended from their office and summoned to render an account of their conduct. They shifted the blame on the Triarchs, and the Triarchs, one of whom was Theramenes, in order to shield themselves, accused the generals of not having issued the orders for rescue, until the high wind made the execution impossible. We are not in a position to judge the question, for the decision must entirely depend on the details of the situation, and as to the details we have no certainty. It is not clear, for instance, whether the storm was sufficiently violent to prevent any attempt at a rescue. The presumption is, however, that the Athenian people were right in the conviction that there had been criminal negligence somewhere, and the natural emotion of indignation which they felt betrayed them into committing a crime themselves. The question was judged by the assembly, and not by the ordinary courts. 2 sittings were held, and the 8 generals who had been present at Arginusae were condemned to death and confiscation of property. 6, including Thrasyllus and Pericles, son of the great statesman, were executed. The other 2 had prudently kept out of the way. Whatever were the rights of the case, the penalty was unduly severe, but the worst feature of the proceedings was that the assembly violated a recognised usage of the city by pronouncing sentence on all the accused together, instead of judging the case of each separately. Formally illegal, indeed, it was not, for the supporters of the generals had not the courage to apply the graphe paranomon. Protests had no effect on the excited multitude, thirsty for vengeance. It was an interesting incident that the philosopher Socrates, who happened on the fatal day to be one of the Prytanes, objected to putting the motion. All constitutions, democracy like oligarchy and monarchy, have their own dangers and injustices. This episode illustrates the gravest kind of injustice which a primary assembly, swayed by a sudden current of violent feeling, and unchecked by any responsibility, sometimes commits and repents. The victory of Arginusae restored to the Athenians the command of the eastern Aegean, and induced the Lacedaemonians to repeat the same propositions of peace which they had made 4 years ago after the battle of Cyzicus, namely, that Decelea should be evacuated, and that otherwise each party should remain just as it was. Through the influence of the demagogue Cleophon, who is said to have come into the assembly drunk, the offer was rejected. Nothing was left for the Spartans but to reorganise their fleet. Eteonicus had gathered together the remnants of the ships and gone to Chios, but he was unable to pay the seamen, who were forced to work as labourers on the fields of Chian farmers. In the winter this means of support failed, and threatened by starvation they formed a conspiracy to pillage the town of Chios. The conspirators agreed to carry a reed stick in order to recognise one another. Eteonicus discovered the plot, but there were so many reed bearers that he shrank from an open conflict, and devised a stratagem. Walking through the streets of Chios, attended by 15 armed men, he met a man who suffered from ophthalmia, coming out of a surgeon's house, and seeing that he had a reed stick, ordered him to be put to death. A crowd gathered and demanded why the man was put to death. The reply was, because he had a reed stick. When the news spread, every reed bearer was so frightened that he threw his reed away. The Chians then consented to supply a month's pay for the men, who were immediately embarked. This incident shows that money had ceased to flow in from Persia. It was generally felt that if further Persian co-operation was to be secured, and the Peloponnesian cause to be restored, the command of the fleet must again be entrusted to Lysander. But there was a law at Sparta that no man could be navarch a second time. On this occasion the law was evaded by sending Lysander out as secretary, but on the understanding that the actual command lay with him, and not with the nominal admiral. Lysander visited Cyrus at Sardis, asserted his old influence over him, and obtained the money he required. With the help of organised parties in the various cities he soon fitted out a fleet. An unlooked-for event gave him still greater power and prestige. King Darius was very ill, his death was expected, and Cyrus was called to his bedside. During his absence Cyrus entrusted to his friend Lysander the administration of his satrapy and the tribute. He knew that money was no temptation to this exceptional Spartan, and he feared to trust such power to a Persian noble. With these resources behind him, Lysander speedily proved his ability. Attacked at Ephesus by the Athenian fleet under Conon, he declined battle. Then, when the enemy had dispersed, he sailed forth, first to Rhodes, and then across the Aegean to the coast of Attica, where he had a consultation with Agis. Recrossing the Aegean, he made for the Hellespont, and laid siege to Lampsacus. The Athenian fleet of 180 ships reunited and followed him thither. Lampsacus had been taken before they reached Sestos, but they determined now to force him to accept the battle which he had refused at Ephesus, and with this view proceeded along the coast till they reached Aegospotami (Goats' Rivers), an open beach without harbourage, over against Lampsacus. It was a bad position, as all the provisions had to be fetched from Sestos, at a distance of about 2 miles, while the Peloponnesian fleet was in an excellent harbour, with a well-supplied town behind. Sailing across the strait, the Athenians found the enemy drawn up for battle, but under orders not to move until they were attacked, and in such a strong position that an attack would have been unwise. They were obliged to return to Aegospotami. For 4 days the same thing befell. Each day the Athenian fleet sailed across the strait and endeavoured to lure Lysander into an engagement. Each day its efforts were fruitless. From his castle in the neighbourhood Alcibiades descried the dangerous position of the Athenians, and riding over to Aegospotami, earnestly counselled the generals to move to Sestos. His sound advice was received with coldness, perhaps with insult. When the fleet returned from its daily cruise to Lampsacus, the seamen used to disembark and scatter on the shore. On the 5th day Lysander sent scout ships which, as soon as the Athenian crews had gone ashore for their meal, were to flash a bright shield as a signal. When the signal was given, the whole Peloponnesian squadron, consisting of about 200 galleys, rowed rapidly across the strait, and found the Athenian fleet defenceless. There was no battle, no resistance. 20 ships, which were in a condition to fight, escaped. The remaining 160 were captured at once. It was generally believed that there was treachery among the generals, and it is possible that Adeimantus, who was taken prisoner and spared, had been bribed by Lysander. All the Athenians who were taken, to the number of 3,000 or 4,000, were put to death. The chief commander, Conon, who was not among the unready, succeeded in getting away. Greek ships usually unshipped their sails when they prepared for a naval battle, and the sails of the Peloponnesian triremes had been deposited at Cape Abanis, near Lampsacus. Informed of this, Conon boldly shot across to Abanis, seized the sails, and so deprived Lysander of the power of an effective pursuit. It would have been madness for the responsible commander to return to Athens with the tidings of such a terrible disaster, and Conon, sending home 12 of the 20 triremes which had escaped, sailed himself with the rest to the protection of Evagorus, the king of Salamis in Cyprus. Never was a decisive victory gained with such small sacrifice as that which Lysander gained at Aegospotami. The tidings of ruin reached the Piraeus at night, and on that night not a man slept. The city remembered the cruel measure which it had once and again meted out to others, as to Melos and Scione, and shuddered at the thought that even such measure might now be meted out to itself. It was hard for the Athenians to realise that at one blow their sea power was annihilated, and they had now to make preparations for sustaining a siege. But the blockade was deferred by the policy of Lysander. He did not intend to attack Athens, but to starve it into surrender, and with this view he drove all the Athenian clerics whom he found in the islands to Athens, in order to swell the starving population. Having completed the subjugation of the Athenian empire in the Hellespont and Thrace, and ordered affairs in those regions, Lysander sailed at length into the Saronic Gulf with 150 ships, occupied Aegina, and blockaded the Piraeus. At the same time the Spartan king Pausanias entered Attica, and joining forces with Agis, encamped in the Academe, west of the city. But the walls were too strong to attack, and at the beginning of winter the army withdrew, while the fleet remained near the Piraeus. As provisions began to fail, the Athenians made a proposal of peace, offering to resign their empire and become allies of Lacedaemon. The envoys were turned back at Sellasia. They would not be received by the Ephors unless they brought more acceptable terms, and it was intimated that the demolition of the long walls for a length of 10 stades was an indispensable condition of peace. It was folly to resist, yet the Athenians resisted. The demagogue Cleophon, who had twice hindered the conclusion of peace when it might have been made with honour, first after Cyzicus, then after Arginusae, now hindered it again when it could be made only with humiliation. An absurd decree was passed that no one should ever propose to accept such terms. But the danger was that such obstinacy would drive the enemy into insisting on an unconditional surrender, for the situation was hopeless. Theramenes undertook to visit Lysander and endeavour to obtain more favourable conditions, or at all events to discover how matters lay. His real object was to gain time, and let the people come to their senses. He remained 3 months with Lysander, and when he returned to Athens he found the citizens prepared to submit on any terms whatever. People were dying of famine, and the reaction of feeling had been marked by the execution of Cleophon, who was condemned on the charge of evading military service. Theramenes was sent to Sparta with full powers. It is interesting to find that during these anxious months a decree was passed recalling to Athens an illustrious citizen who had been found wanting as a general, but whose genius was to make immortal the war now drawing to its close, the historian Thucydides. An assembly of the Peloponnesian Allies was called together at Sparta to determine how they should deal with the fallen foe. The general sentiment was that no mercy should be shown, that Athens should be utterly destroyed, and the whole people sold into slavery. But Sparta never felt the same bitterness towards Athens as that which animated Corinth and Thebes. She was neither a neighbour nor a commercial rival. The destruction of Athens might have been politically profitable, but Sparta, with all her faults, could on occasion rise to nobler views. She resolutely rejected the barbarous proposal of the Confederacy. She would not blot out a Greek city which had done such noble services to Greece against the Persian invader. That was more than 2 generations ago. But it was not to be forgotten. Athens was saved by her past. The terms of the peace were: the long walls and fortifications of the Piraeus were to be destroyed. The Athenians lost all their foreign possessions, but remained independent, confined to Attica and Salamis. Their whole fleet, with the exception of 12 triremes, was forfeited. All exiles were allowed to return. Athens became the ally of Sparta, pledged to follow her leadership. When the terms were ratified, Lysander sailed into the Piraeus. The demolition of the long walls immediately began. The Athenians and their conquerors together pulled them down to the music of flute players, and the jubilant allies thought that freedom had at length dawned for the Greeks. Lysander permitted Athens to retain 12 triremes, and having inaugurated the destruction of the fortifications, sailed off to reduce Samos. It is not to be supposed that all Athenians were dejected and wretched at the terrible humiliation which had befallen their native city. There were numerous exiles who owed their return to her calamity, and the extreme oligarchic party rejoiced in the foreign occupation, regarding it as an opportunity for the subversion of the democracy, and the re-establishment of a constitution like that which had been tried after the Sicilian expedition. Theramenes looked forward to making a new attempt to introduce his favourite polity. Of the exiles, the most prominent and determined was Critias, son of Callaeschrus, and a member of the same family as the lawgiver Solon. He was a man of many parts, a pupil of Gorgias, and a companion of Socrates, an orator, a poet, and a philosopher. A combination was formed between the exiles and the home oligarchs. A common plan of action was organised, and the chief democratic leaders were presently seized and imprisoned. The intervention of Lysander was then invoked for the establishing of a new constitution, and awed by his presence, the assembly passed a measure proposed by Dracontides, that a body of 30 should be nominated for the purpose of drawing up laws and managing public affairs until the code should be completed. The oligarchs did not take the trouble to repeal the law which would expose the proposer of the measure to prosecution by the Graphi Paranomon. They felt sure of their power. Critias, Theramenes, and Dracontides were among the 30 who were appointed. The ruin of the power of Athens had fallen out to the advantage of the oligarchical party, and it has even been suspected that the oligarchs had for many years past deliberately planned to place the city at the mercy of the enemy, for the ulterior purpose of destroying the democracy. The part played by Theramenes in the condemnation of the generals who had the indiscretion to win Arginusae, the parts he subsequently played in negotiating the peace and in establishing the oligarchy, the serious suspicions of treachery in connexion with the disaster of Aegospotami, have especially suggested this conjecture. The attempt of the 400 on a previous occasion to come to terms with Sparta may be taken into account, and the comparatively lenient terms imposed on Athens might seem to point in the same direction. One thing seemed certain. The oligarchic party had been distinctly aiming at peace, and the repeated opposition of Cleophon, impolitic as we have seen, indicates that he suspected oligarchical designs. It must also be admitted that the conduct of the Athenians in fixing their station at Aegospotami, and delivering themselves to the foe like sheep led to the altar, argues a measure of folly which seems almost incredible, if there were not treachery behind. And the suspicion is confirmed by the clemency shown to Adimantus. It must, however, be acknowledged that it is hard to understand how the treason could have been effectually carried out without the connivance of Conon, the commander-in-chief, yet no suspicion seems to have been attached to him. The whole problem of the oligarchic intrigues of the last 8 years of the war remains wrapped in far greater mystery than the mutilation of the Hermae. End of Part 9.
Chapter 11, Part 10 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 11, Part 10. Rule of the 30 and Restoration of the Democracy. The purpose for which the 30 had been appointed was to frame a new constitution. Their powers as a governing body were only to last until they had completed their legislative work. The more part of them, however, with Critias, who was the master spirit, had no serious thoughts of constructing a constitution. They regarded this as merely a pretext for getting into power, and their only object was to retain the power in their own hands, establishing a simple oligarchy. In this, however, they were not absolutely unanimous. One of them, at least, Theramenes, had no taste for pure oligarchy, but was still genuinely intent on framing a polity tempered of both oligarchic and democratic elements. This dissension in the views of the two ablest men, Critias and Theramenes, soon led to fatal disunion. The first measures of the 30 were, however, carried out with cordial unanimity. A council of 500, consisting of strong supporters of oligarchy, was appointed and invested with the judicial functions which had before belonged to the people. A body of 11, under the command of Satyrus, a violent, unscrupulous man, was appointed for police duties, and the guard of the Piraeus was committed to a body of 10. The chief democrats, who on the fall of Athens had opposed the establishment of an oligarchy, were then seized, tried by the council, and condemned to death for conspiracy. So far there was unanimity, but at this point Theramenes would have stopped. At such times moderate councils have small chance of winning, ranged beside the extreme policies of resolute men like Critias, who had come back in a bitter and revengeful spirit against democracy, relentlessly resolved to exercise an absolute despotism and expunge all elements of popular opposition. A polity on the broad basis which Theramenes desired was as obnoxious to Critias as the old democracy, into which he was convinced it would soon deviate. He and his colleagues were therefore afraid of all prominent citizens of moderate views, whether democratic or oligarchic, who were awaiting with impatience the constitution which the 30 had been appointed to prepare, the men on whom the polity of Theramenes, if it came into existence, would mainly rest. The 30 had announced as part of their programme that they would purge the city of wrongdoers. They put to death a number of men of bad character, including some notorious informers. But they presently proceeded to execute, with or without trial, not only prominent democrats, but also men of oligarchical views, who, though unfriendly to democracy, were also unfriendly to injustice and illegality. Among the latter victims was Niceratus, the son of Nicias. To the motives of fear and revenge was soon added the appetite for plunder, and some men were executed because they were rich, while many fled, happy to escape with their lives. Even metics, who had little to do with politics, were despoiled. Thus the speechwriter Lysias and his brother Polemarchus, who kept a lucrative manufactory of shields, were arrested, and while Lysias succeeded in making his escape, Polemarchus was put to death. And while many Athenians were removed by hemlock, or driven into banishment, others were required to assist in the revolting service of arresting fellow citizens in order that they might thereby become accomplices in the guilt of the government. Thus the philosopher Socrates and 4 others were commanded with severe threats to arrest an honest citizen, Leon of Salamis. Socrates refused without hesitation to do the bidding of the tyrants. The others were not so brave. Yet Socrates was not punished for his defiance, and this immunity was perhaps due to some feeling of piety in the heart of Critias, who had been one of his pupil companions, a feeling which might be safely indulged, as the philosopher was neither wealthy nor popular. To these judicial murders and this organized system of plundering, Theramenes was unreservedly opposed. The majority of the council shared his disapprobation, and he would have been able to establish a moderate constitution but for the ability and strength of Critias. His representations indeed induced the 30 to broaden the basis on which their power rested, by creating a body of 3,000 citizens who had the privilege of bearing arms and the right of being tried by the council. All outside that body were liable to be condemned to death by sentence of the 30 without a trial. The body of 3,000 had practically no political rights, and were chosen so far as possible from known partisans of the government, the staunchest of whom were the 1,000 knights. This measure naturally did not satisfy Theramenes. His suggestions had, in fact, been used with a purpose very different from his, to secure, not to alter, the government. In the meantime, the exiles whom the oligarchy had driven from Athens were not idle. They had found refuge in those neighbouring states, Corinth, Megara, and Thebes, which had been bitter foes of Athens, but were now undergoing a considerable change of feeling. Dissatisfaction with the high-handed proceedings of Sparta, who would not give them a share in the spoils of war, had disposed them to look with more favour on their fallen enemy, and to feel disgust at the proceedings of the 30 who were under the aegis of Lysander. They were therefore not only ready to grant hospitality to Athenian exiles, but to lend some help towards delivering their city from the oppression of the tyrants. The first step was made from Thebes. Thrasybulus and Anytus, with a band of 70 exiles, seized the Attic fortress of Phyle in the Parnes range close to the Boeotian frontier, and put into a state of defence the strong stone walls, whose ruins are still there. The 30 led out their forces, their faithful knights and 3,000 hoplites, and sat down to blockade the stronghold. But a timely snowstorm broke up the blockade. The army retired to Athens, and for the next 3 months or more nothing further was done against Thrasybulus and the men of Phyle. The oligarchs were now in a dangerous position, menaced without by an enemy against whom their attack had failed, menaced within by a strong opposition. They saw that the influence of Theramenes, who was thoroughly dissatisfied with their policy, would be thrown into the scale against them, and they resolved to get rid of him. Having posted a number of devoted creatures armed with hidden daggers near the railing of the council house, Critias arose in the assembled council, and denounced Theramenes as a traitor and conspirator against the state, a man who could not be trusted an inch, in view of those repeated tergiversations which had won him the nickname of the Buskin. The reply of Theramenes, denouncing the impolicy of Critias and his colleagues, is said to have been received with applause by most of the council, who really sympathized with him. Critias, seeing that he would be acquitted by the council, resorted to an extreme measure. He struck the name of Theramenes out of the list of the 3,000. Footnote: an appearance of legality seems to have been given to this act. A law was passed, presumably on the spot, that persons who had opposed the 400 in 411 BC, or taken part in destroying the fort at Eetionia, should be excluded from the constitution. End of footnote. And then along with his colleagues condemned him to death, since those who were not included in the list could not claim the right of trial. Theramenes leapt on the sacred hearth and appealed for protection to the council, but the council was stupefied with terror, and at the command of Critias the 11 entered, and dragged the suppliant from the altar. He was borne away to prison, the hemlock was immediately administered, and when he had drunk, he tossed out a drop that remained at the bottom of the cup, as banqueters used to do in the game of Cotobus, exclaiming, "This drop for the gentle Critias." There had perhaps been a dose of truth in the reproaches which the gentle Critias had hurled at him across the floor of the council chamber. Theramenes may have been shifty and unscrupulous where means and methods were concerned. But in his main object he was perfectly sincere. He was sincere in desiring to establish a moderate polity which should unite the merits of both oligarchy and democracy, and avoid their defects. There can be no question that he was honestly interested in trying this political experiment, and the very nature of this policy involved an appearance of insincerity and gave rise to suspicion. It led him to oscillate between the democratic and oligarchical parties, seeking to gain influence and support in both, with a view to the ultimate realization of his middle plan. And thus the Democrats suspected him as an oligarch, the oligarchs distrusted him as a democrat. In judging Theramenes, it seems fair to remember that a politician who in unsettled times desires to direct the state into a middle course between two opposite extremes can hardly avoid oscillation more or less, can rarely escape the imputation of the buskin. After the death of Theramenes, the 30 succeeded in disarming, by means of a stratagem, all the citizens who were not enrolled in the list of the 3,000, and expelled them from the city. But with a foe on Attic ground, growing in numbers every day, Critias and his fellows felt themselves so insecure that they took the step of sending an embassy to Sparta to ask for a Lacedaemonian garrison. The request was granted, and 700 men under Calybius were introduced into the Acropolis. The 30 would never have resorted to this measure except under the dire pressure of necessity, for not only was it unpopular, but they had to pay the strangers out of their own chest. It was perhaps in the first days of the month of May that it was resolved to make a second attempt to dislodge the Democrats from Philae. A band of the knights and the Spartan garrison sallied forth, but near Acharnae they were surprised at night and routed with great loss by Thrasybulus. This incident produced considerable alarm at Athens, and the 30 had reason to fear that many of their partisans were wavering. Deciding to secure an eventual place of refuge in case Athens should become untenable, they seized Eleusis and put about 300 Eleusinians to death. This measure had hardly been carried out when Thrasybulus descended from Philae and seized the Piraeus. He had now about 1,000 men, but the Piraeus, without fortifications, was not an easy place to defend. he drew up his forces on the hill of Munichia, occupying the temples of Artemis and the Thracian goddess Bendis, which stood at the summit of a steep street. Highest of all stood the darters and slingers, ready to shoot over the heads of the hoplites. Thus posted, with his prophet by his side, Thrasybulus awaited the attack of the 30, who had led down all their forces to the Piraeus. A shower of darts descended on their heads as they mounted the hill, and, while they wavered for a moment under the missiles, the hoplites rushed down on them, led by the prophet, who had foretold his own death in the battle, and was the first to perish. 70 of the enemy were slain, among them Critias himself. During the truce which was then granted for taking up the dead, the citizens on either side held some converse with one another, and Cleocritus, the herald of the Eleusinian Mysti, impressive both by his loud voice and by his sacred calling, addressed the adherents of the 30. "Fellow citizens, why seek ye to slay us? Why do ye force us into exile, us who never did you wrong? We have shared in the same religious rites and festivals. We have been your schoolfellows and choirfellows. We have fought with you by land and sea for freedom. We adjure you, by our common gods, abandon the cause of the 30, monsters of impiety, who for their own gains have slain in 8 months more Athenians than the Peloponnesians slew in a war of 10 years. Believe that we have shed as many tears as you for those who have now fallen." This general appeal and individual appeals in the same tone at such an affecting moment must have produced an effect upon the half-hearted soldiers of the 30, who had now lost their able and violent leader. There was dissension and discord not only among the 3,000 and the council, but among the 30 themselves. It was felt that the government of the 30 could no longer be maintained, and that if the oligarchy was to be rescued, a new government must be installed. A general meeting of the 3,000 deposed the 30 and instituted in their stead a body of 10, one from each tribe. One member of the 30 was re-elected as a member of the new government, but the rest withdrew to the refuge which they had provided for themselves at Eleusis. The new body of 10 represented the views of those who were genuinely devoted to oligarchy, but disapproved of the extreme policy of Critias and his fellows. They failed to come to terms with Thrasybulus, who was every day receiving reinforcements both in men and arms. The civil war continued, and it soon appeared that it would be impossible for Athens to hold out against the Democrats in the Piraeus without foreign aid. An embassy was accordingly dispatched by the 10 to Sparta, and about the same time the remnant of the 30 at Eleusis sent a message on their own account for the same purpose. Both embassies represented the Democrats at Piraeus as rebels against the power of Sparta. The Lacedaemonian government, through the influence of Lysander, was induced to intervene in support of the 10. Lysander assembled an army at Eleusis, and 40 ships were sent under Libis to cut off the supplies which the Democrats received by sea. The outlook was now gloomy for Thrasybulus and his company, but they were rescued by a disunion within the Lacedaemonian state. The influence of Lysander, which had been for the last years supreme, was perceptibly declining. The king Pausanias was his declared opponent, and many others of the governing class were jealous of his power, vexed at his arrogance, perhaps suspicious of his designs. The oligarchies which he had created at Athens and in the other cities of the Athenian empire had disgraced themselves by misgovernment and bloodshed, and the disgrace was reflected upon the fame of their creator. Lysander had hardly begun his work when Pausanias persuaded the ephors to entrust to himself the commission of restoring tranquillity at Athens, and Lysander had the humiliation of handing over to his rival the army which he had mustered. A defeat convinced Thrasybulus that it would be wise to negotiate, and on the other hand Pausanias deposed the irreconcilable 10 and caused it to be replaced by another 10 of more moderate views. Both parties then, the city and the Piraeus alike, submitted themselves to Spartan intervention, and Sparta, under the auspices of King Pausanias, acquitted herself uncommonly well. A commission of 15 was sent from Lacedaemon to assist the king, and a reconciliation was brought about. The terms were a general and mutual pardon for all past acts, from which were excepted only the 30, the 10 who had held the Piraeus under the 30, the 11 who had carried out the judicial murders perpetrated by the 30, and the 10 who had succeeded the 30. All these excepted persons were required to give an account of their acts if they wished to remain at Athens. Eleusis was to form an independent state, and any Athenian who chose might migrate to Eleusis within a specified time. The evil dream of Athens was at last over. A year and a half of oligarchical tyranny and foreign soldiery on the Acropolis. She owed her deliverance to the energy of Thrasybulus and the discretion of Pausanias. Pausanias displayed his discretion further by not meddling with the reconciled parties in their settlement of the constitution. It was decreed, on the motion of Tissaphernes, that lawgivers should be appointed to revise the constitution, and that in the meantime the state should be administered according to the laws of Solon and the institutions of Dracon. The union of the two names is significant of the conciliation. Provisionally, then, the franchise was limited to those who belonged to the first 3 Solonian classes, those who could at least serve as hoplites. It is noteworthy that there was an idea afloat of making the possession of landed property a qualification for political rights, but it was a totally unpractical idea. Such a test would have excluded rich men. It would have included many of the 4th class. In the end, no new experiment was tried. The lawgivers restored the old democracy with its unlimited franchise, and Athens entered upon a new stage of her career. The amnesty was faithfully kept. The democrats did not revenge themselves on the supporters of the oligarchical tyranny. But it was easier to forgive than forget, and for many years after the reconciliation a distinction was drawn, though not officially, yet in the ordinary intercourse of life, between the men of the city and the men of the Piraeus, the men who had fought for freedom and those who had fought against it. That was almost inevitable, and so long as the oligarchs held Eleusis, there might even be some ground for suspecting the loyalty of their old supporters. After about 2 years of independent existence, Eleusis was attacked by Athens, the Eleusinian generals were captured and put to death, and the town resumed its old place as part of Attica. Henceforward, for well nigh 3 generations, the Athenian democracy was perfectly secure from the danger or fear of an oligarchical revolution. That hideous nightmare of the 30 had established it on a firmer base than ever. End of chapter 11, part 10. Recording by Graham Redman.